So good evening, everyone. I'm Hannah Burling, President of the League of Women Voters of New Mexico. Tonight, we have Amber Wallin with us, the Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. Born and raised in New Mexico, got her Master's of Public Administration from New Mexico State, and worked in the public sector at the city, state, and federal levels before joining Voices in 2012. She is a state and nationally recognized expert on issues related to child and family well-being and fiscal policy, and served on many fiscal policy and child well-being advisory committees, among policy networks, philanthropic organizations, governmental bodies. Amber has covered a great deal of ground, and she regularly shares the information and recommendations on how to build greater equity and opportunities for children and families. The League is lucky to have her share these with us regularly. Tonight, she'll be talking about Constitutional Amendment 1. And she has also dropped in the chat a link to the Albuquerque Journal editorial opposing the amendment. So you might look there and go to the link and you'll find it later to read. So Amber, would you like to begin? Let me.
Yes. Should I go ahead and start sharing, Hannah?
Please do, if you'd like.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for having me here before I start sharing. Just really appreciate working with you all and getting to talk with you all every now and again. And Hannah and Dick, you all are such important members of our partnerships and all the work that we do for kids and families in New Mexico with many other partners. And so very happy to be here this evening. And I have some slides, so we'll go ahead and go through those. I'll share some information about the constitutional amendment, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions as well. And I'll make sure to share the slides so that, you know, don't feel like you have to copy everything down. There's some that have a lot of text and information on them, but we'll send them along so that know that you'll get a copy of those. Let me go ahead and start sharing. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hannah. So again, I'm Amber Wallin. I'm the Executive Director at New Mexico Voices for Children, and just really happy to be here this evening and get to talk to you all about an effort that we've been working on at Voices for close to 13 years. And so now it's finally on the ballot, and it's a constitutional amendment that will provide additional funding for early childhood programs as well as K-12 education programs. And so we'll go ahead and jump right in. I recognize most of the folks on the call. I've been here before, but just for those who aren't familiar with Voices, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that does research and policy and advocacy work on policy issue areas that impact kids and families in New Mexico. And so our mission, you can see there, but it's really to push for public policies that can improve the well-being and the equity of New Mexico's children and our families and communities. And we mainly work in the areas of health and education and economics. And what we're talking about tonight really crosses all of those different issue areas. That's who we are as an organization. Now, I'm presenting on behalf of our bigger coalition. It's called Vote Yes for Kids. And this is a statewide coalition of nonprofit policy groups, grassroots groups, childcare providers, teachers unions, and faith-based groups that we have all come together to advocate really for better support for our state's kids and our classrooms and teachers and early childhood care and education programs in the state. And so you can see there some of the organizations that we're working with on this effort as part of our Vote Yes for Kids coalition. And so that's our organizations, but really big picture at the heart. We're of course bigger than any one of us as organizations because we are all just like you all. We're all New Mexico residents. We're parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, family members, community members, workers, employers, who all benefit from kids and families in our state really having great opportunities to thrive. We're all people with hopes and dreams for our families and for our communities and for the state. And so that's really what unites us together in this effort to build better opportunities in the early childhood space, especially, but also just to provide greater resources for our kids and our families. We're going to jump in, and what I'm going to start with is I wanted to start with a little bit of background on New Mexico's Permanent School Fund. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. That's what the constitutional amendment is based around. But the Permanent School Fund, which you all might know of as the Land Grant Permanent Fund, it was created when we became a state in 1912. And only the voters have the power to change anything about the Permanent School Fund. Because right now, part of the Permanent School Fund, 5%, goes to help support education in the state every year. And it's set up as a trust fund, again, enshrined in our Constitution. And one thing I'll mention about that real quick, and you can see it on the slide, but the reason that we bring this distinction is sometimes when we talk about trust funds, you often might hear, you might read, well, trust funds, you can only invest so much. You need to protect a certain amount of the corpus, as it's known, the main body of a fund, so it'll continue to grow. What is special about the Land Grant Permanent Fund as a trust fund is that it actually has two sources of income. So it doesn't just grow based on the money that's in it, earning interest. It also grows from money that it receives from oil and gas and mineral rights and production on a lot of property in the state. You can see there are 13 million acres. So it grows quite a bit every year. On average, it grows 11% every year. As I said, the state constitution right now requires that a small portion of the fund go to support public education. And you'll see there, the last line is interesting. Right now, the Permanent School Fund is valued at $26 billion. So that's with a B billion. When Voices started working on this issue 13 years ago, it was $10 billion. So you can see that it's grown dramatically over the years and continues to grow. And so our history with the fund started really in 2009, 2008, 2009. And to give a little bit of context of where we were as a state in 2008 is that we were suffering the effects of a recession. So our state didn't have a lot of financial resources, but where we also were as a state and as a nation and as advocates really were beginning to understand just how important those early childhood years are for children, how important they can be for positive, healthy brain development, social, emotional development, and then also, of course, for learning. But we know that about 90% of brain development happens in those first 5 years. And so programs that support those early years, things like childcare assistance, pre-K, home visiting, parental coaching, really healthy development programs, that those were all these really key programs that could help kids out. But we also knew at that time that we were providing basically no funding for those programs as a state. So we had a big problem. We knew what the solutions were, but we didn't have any money to do it. And so at Voices, we're kind of fiscal policy folks. And so some people on our team, some of which are still at Voices, came up with the idea of, well, you know, the Land Grant Permanent Fund, the Permanent School Fund, is meant to be devoted towards education. And it's massive. At that time, we thought 10 billion was massive. And, you know, now, of course, it's more than doubled, but we thought, well, maybe that's an option. And so we evaluated different funding mechanisms for early childhood and thought this should be an important part of how we get towards building a robust early system that really matches the need in that area, the research and how important those early years were, and then met the demands of our state. And so in 2009, we came together with a group of stakeholders, other advocates, childcare providers, teachers, to really talk about this issue. In 2011, the first bill was introduced to use a very small portion of the Land Grant Permanent Fund, and we formed a formal coalition at that time that we called Invest in Kids Now. And then in 2013, that bill first got out of the House of Representatives. So a little bit of progress at a time. You can see these are some of the wonkier details, but the it was a House Joint Memorial. It's what constitutional amendments are called, but kind of a form of legislative bill that kept being held up. And so it largely would get to the Senate, and the Senate would not let it through, consistently passed by the House. Over that time, I'd say one thing that was important was that we as advocates and working in partnership with lawmakers and other groups, as everybody really kind of recognized just how important those early years were, the state started putting more money towards early childhood education programs and really began to build an infrastructure around that. And in some ways, it was like, well, we're not passing this, we're not putting big money towards it, but we are building infrastructure. We are making some gradual progress. And so that happened for a few years. In 2020, most notably, the state created the Early Childhood Trust Fund, which also supports early childhood education. And then in 2020, something that happened, and I'd say to your all's power as an organization and to your formulation and the reason you all exist, voting and the power of voting, several powerful Democratic senators lost re-election, and they were those same senators who were largely holding back. This is one of the pieces of legislation. And so when those senators lost their primaries, they were replaced by other senators who then, when they had the power, let a bill go through. And so then in 2021, we saw the first major progress on the Land Grant Permanent Fund constitutional amendment. And so you can see there, this is an op-ed by the Santa Fe New Mexican. So this is an op-ed from the actual paper. And I think they pretty aptly called it a game changer for children, because it was something that can be, there's not often that there's legislation that it has the power to be truly transformational. And this is one of those pieces of legislation. And so you see there, the New Mexican called it such. It passed. And so what that meant is once it passed through both chambers of the New Mexico legislature, then it goes to the voters because it's a constitutional amendment. So now it's on the ballot. It'll be on the ballot in the November election. And so there's still some ways to go as we move forward on this. And what I'm going to jump into now is what it actually looks like on the ballot. And I'm going to leave the slide up for a minute or two, because you all know this very well, that sometimes ballot measures are written in a very jargony way. So I'll leave that up for just a second so folks can read what it reads as. And so, you know, the reason I leave that up is because I'm gonna get into next what the ballot measure really is, but something that we all learned as a coalition, something that the lawmakers who carried it learned, despite carrying the bill for many years, is that whatever the bill title is what ends up on the ballot. And it's just interesting that as long as many people had worked on this and worked on other pieces of legislation, as folks like probably Dick knows really well, lots of times when bills move through the legislature, they change quite a bit and things get hung onto bills, and they may be a small portion of it. But the titles often look jargony because they reflect every tiny element of a bill. And so the constitutional amendment, this is the title of the bill that ended up passing. And so it looks, there's a lot of stuff in there that that can be kind of confusing. That's one of the things that we actually feel is kind of a hindrance and makes passing the constitutional amendment harder, because when you really dissect that language, there's a bit of, oh wait, I thought I was voting for something related to early childhood. What are these other things in here? And so we're going to talk a bit about what the ballot question actually means. The ballot question, first of all, it's going to be on the back of the November ballot. And so again, I'm just flagging that as another challenge. The ballot measure is strongly supported by New Mexico voters, but there's a number of reasons why we feel like it's not something that we should take for granted. And one is that it's on the back of the ballot during the general election. The question asks voters about approving a very small additional percentage. So remember at the beginning, I said that currently 5% of the fund comes out every year to help support education in the state. What's happening here is that an additional 1.25% of the fund would come out to support education in early childhood. So that means that the total coming out of the fund every year would be from 5% to 6.25%. So it's still a very small percentage. But using the value of the fund right now, that would result in about $150 million available for early childhood programs. And these are those things that I mentioned: childcare assistance, pre-K, home visiting, programs like that, early intervention. And then about 100 million would be more funding for K-12 educational programs. So standard K-12 education funding that goes to support schools and teachers and classrooms. And so all of those would go to support kids and families in New Mexico. And so again, and I just mentioned that this money does not require any tax raises. It's not additional revenue coming in from new sources. It's simply taking a little bit more of that permanent fund to go towards our programs that have not yet been ever fully funded in the state. And to give you an idea about how those funds could be spent, so you can see here some of the different ways that they could be spent: hiring more teachers, expanding early childhood services, creating technical and job training programs in high school, teacher salaries, classroom technology and basic infrastructure in our schools, mental health services, student support staff, which we know it's not just our teachers, it's our nurses and our social workers and our counselors, expanding programs that are specifically targeted to supporting at-risk students. And then another option, again, and you can see it in parentheses there, optional for communities and for schools to use the funding to extend the school year if schools want to do that. And so these are some different options, but one of the things that I would say is that there is already a really strong and robust infrastructure set up to use this funding. So New Mexico has a really strong record of creating evidence-based programs, policy programs, early childhood programs. We have our schools in place. The issue right now is that they are underfunded and have long been underfunded. New Mexico lost a school funding lawsuit just a few years ago about our historic underfunding of education and of our schools. And we know also that early childhood, that just right now, so many families in our state lack access, not just to these services, but even when they can access them, they don't have cost sharing. So families are still paying a tremendous amount, for example, childcare and pre-K programs without state assistance. And then we know that our early childhood workers especially are not making family sustaining wages. So we have this really, early childhood is one of those areas where you have centers and providers that are having a really hard time staying in business. You have workers who are barely making money to feed their families. And then you also have families who, I know what it's like because I've had 2 kids in preschool at the same time before. It costs more than college tuition. And so it's an area where government intervention and government cost sharing needs to come in to help support the industry. And we know, and we learned during COVID, what can happen when the childcare industry is not strong, then our economy can't be strong. We saw that during COVID, when so many mothers were having to stay home to care for their kids and to homeschool their kids. So there is so much need in our state, and $250 million is a way towards getting to support some more robust funding. And Karen, I will send along all the slides. They're really meaty ones, so we'll make sure to send those along. Something that, I'd also say that we hear, well, aren't we, see, funding formula will be a separate line item. So the money will come out, and to the question that was in the chat from Joe, the money will come out, and so it will go into the K-12 portion will go into the school funding formula, and then the early childhood portion will go directly to the early childhood department for funding. And one of the questions that we've heard more recently is, well, we've seen big expansions in early childhood. Aren't we there? We've seen a lot of good things happen. And I want to lift that up because we've seen incredible progress, especially in the past 2 years from this administration. I posted here, this is a Washington Post article. New Mexico got a slew of national coverage when earlier this year, New Mexico expanded child care assistance, so cost help for child care, to nearly all New Mexico families. About 95% of kids in the state have access to this child care assistance, and we know that's a game changer for families. We also know that some of the best way to improve outcomes for kids is to ensure that their families have economic resources. And so childcare assistance is one of the most important ways to do that. And New Mexico is leaps and bounds ahead of the states in some ways by creating an early childhood program department. We were one of the first to do that, expanding childcare assistance. But the thing is, even, and I use this as an example because it's temporary, you can see there, it's 1 year. It's using federal money, it's using COVID relief money to fund expanded childcare services. This is not permanent money. Another thing that we've heard a lot is, well, we've been expanding it. Didn't we just create this new trust fund a couple of years ago? Doesn't it have a lot of money? It does have a lot of money, which is great because we have long funded this area. It does have a lot of money, but most of that is coming from an oil and gas boom that we're currently in, and it's coming from federal relief money. Two sources of money that we know will not hold out. Two sources of money that 3 years from now we don't expect to still have. And so we're in an incredibly unique situation in New Mexico right now from a funding point, but it's not a long-term one. And we've also seen incredible expansions, but they're not permanent. And we have incredible leadership, especially at our state's early childhood department, with a great infrastructure set up. That's the good thing about all this progress, is that we've really built out infrastructure that now is ripe to have more funding come in to be able to support the progress that we've made and build upon that progress in some important ways. And as you all know, and as I'm going to share a few slides tonight, but we have a statewide campaign is really in full swing. We have that real broad coalition that I mentioned. We're doing a lot of social media and digital work. We're doing a lot of op-eds, interviews, things of that nature. We just started running TV ads this week. We're doing events, working a lot with our congressional delegation who are really strongly stepping in. Polling is showing that nearly 70% of New Mexico voters are in strong support. And then really working on get out the vote efforts, because as you all well know, people voting is a different thing. People feeling support for an issue is very different from people taking action on an issue. And so though this is something that we've long worked on and that people genuinely do support, and certainly I think people feel in their guts how important that early childhood area is, and childcare especially, there's still a big get out the vote effort, which we think is incredibly important, just knocking on tens of thousands of doors across the state. And, you know, we really welcome involvement because it's really necessary. This, we don't feel at all is a sure thing to happen. It took us 13 years to get this far. And so we know it's still an uphill battle. But these are some different ways that folks could get involved if they were interested in getting involved in the campaign. And certainly I would say one of the most important things is just talking to friends and family and neighbors and communicating about the issue. And it's about something that you're interested in, and reminding people, turn over the ballot, check it out. It's #1, Constitutional Amendment #1. And then of course, most importantly, just getting out and voting and sharing that information. And we have a couple different websites. We have this first one here is our official campaign website. And then we have more information that's a little more along these lines about how the fund works on our website at newmexicovoices.org. And then my email is there, and you all can always feel free to reach out to me anytime with any questions or in need of any other information. And, you know, with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I'd also love to open it up to Dick. And you know, you've worked on this issue in partnership for a very long time, and so I'd love to hear other people's perspectives or anything you felt that I maybe left out that you would like to add.
Well, Amber, this is Dick Mason, and I'm co-chair of the Action Committee of the League of Women Voters. I just want to say that the League did support HJR1 in the legislature, and we are supporting vote yes on the Constitutional Amendment 1. So this is, you know, the League doesn't always take positions on issues, you know, on the ballot, but this one we are fully behind it. So I just want to say that.
And I'd like to say that one of the things that I noticed when people are opposed to this is that they talk about how we're robbing future children. We are not. The average return for a trust fund is between 5 and 7%. And we're going to up this from 5% to what, 6.25?
Mm-hmm.
And this fund normally brings in 11%.
Mm-hmm.
No one is being robbed. And furthermore, the children of the future are going to benefit enormously from having an educated, skilled parent group.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Yeah. And we think about, all the kids who have, the decade of kids who didn't have services or didn't have access to services because we weren't devoting the funding to it. Those are a lost generation, or kids who lost out on a generation worth of services.
So we have Meredith and then Joe, and we have a couple of question in the chat.
Hi, Amber. Thank you so much for once again thoroughly explaining so articulately the constitutional amendment, the legislation, the fund, and so on. And as you know, we've been with you all the way for the last 13 years advocating. And I can't tell you how frustrating it's been to have that the legislation die in the roundhouse. And my argument in testifying for the resolution has always been, let the voters decide. Let the voters decide. Yeah. Don't kill it in this building. And because I have to say that the research on early childhood that was done by a major Head Start study shows that the return is something like 12 to 1 for investments in early childhood education because of the rapid brain growth that you were talking about, and also for social services costs that might be incurred later on if someone doesn't have a good solid upbringing. Sometimes the state pays in social services, like with substance abuse, with criminal justice, with dropout, people who are not fulfilling their potential in terms of career growth and so on, because they didn't get a healthy, good start. So anyway, the investment is so important, and I thank you for your work.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you for that partnership over the years. And I also just really appreciate you bringing up some of that evidence. That just makes me realize that I need to add a slide for that. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because that's a way to improve upon just even the sharing of information. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joe?
Thank you. This has been great information. I really like the slides. I wanted to ask you though, we've had some conversations down south about, that putting more money doesn't seem to be helping. And of course, the kids count information the timing has been really bad for this constitutional amendment. And so I'm hoping that you'll give me a couple of examples of something we could include in our presentations. When someone says, look, you had COVID money, you've gotten additional funding from the legislature, teachers are now earning more down here, and yet now New Mexico still ranked number 50. So I was hoping maybe you would have a slide or two about, here's some of the extra things that we have gotten that has seen a lot of progress with student instruction and outcomes. And we could do so much better if we had this additional 1.25%. But how do you feel about that? And what do you generally try to talk about when people are saying we've had more money, we're not seeing the gains?
Yeah, I think you articulated that really well, Joe, and just reflecting what a lot of folks are feeling about it. And you all know we're the Kids Count organization in the state, and so we're often the ones who are sharing that information. And I'd say the rankings themselves, I think, are not the story, and I've always kind of felt that way. But this year, the rankings are particularly not the story because it's old data because of COVID data collections. And so unfortunately, that ranking is almost all pre-19. It's based on 2016 through mostly 2019, 2016 through 2020. And so it was unfortunate. We don't do the rankings ourselves. We report them from the National Foundation that does, who's our partner. But it was a lot of saying, New Mexico has actually done a lot that is not at all captured in this data, that doesn't reflect kind of the progress we've made. But that's still different from what folks feel, well, why aren't we getting better? And haven't we spent a lot of money? And one of the things that I have really appreciated, there was a recent conversation in the LFC, the Legislative Finance Committee, and the Legislative Education Study Committee had some conversations where they also highlighted these are effective programs and they are working. And what we often will say is we have expanded, but instead of measuring how much we've increased, we need to be looking at what the need is in our state. And right now, the Early Childhood Department estimates that there's going to be an over $400 million annual gap to provide early childhood services in the state. And so while we have expanded, you know, if you start from kind of square one, that is a lot. You know, if you, there's quotes about statistics, but there's ways to frame that as, yeah, we have. And I think it is a genuine kudos to lawmakers who have expanded early childhood services. But when you compare that to the actual need in the state, there's still so much need. And I think a real tangible example is we've done great. We just expanded childcare assistance to most every family, but that's for 1 year. How do we continue that so mothers can go to work? How do we increase wages so that teachers aren't making $11 an hour? And for folks who have kids or grandkids in the system know, early childhood teacher turnover is major. And you're lucky if you get a teacher for the whole year. And it's because those providers are leaving, they're going into our K-12 system. We've increased teacher wages over the past few years in K-12 education system. And we needed to do that. We were near the bottom. We were for a while the worst in the nation in teacher pay. So now we're maybe slightly better, but that still requires a tremendous amount of resources to do that. And you know what, we're talking about, you know, generational cycles and not election cycles. And so, you know, when there are some things that you can make an investment, tax policy is one of them. You can make an investment and families can see a return. When you make an investment in education, that's a longer payoff. When you make an investment, especially in brain development and in the early childhood years, that's a long-term payoff. And so I think to something you said, Joe, and to something that Meredith said, just we're investing in our kids' brains. And you know, so we have to lean on the evidence of what does the system need instead of what have we done so far? It's like, that's great, but what else do our kids and families need?
And can I do one quick follow-up? You said the information, but it went over my head. What percentage of the new monies would go to ECD versus the funding formula?
Great question. Yeah, so it's a 60-40 split. So 60% of the new money would go to early childhood programs, and then 40% would go towards K-12.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Elisa?
Yes, Amber, thank you for your presentation. But, you know, I think that presentation would have been very effective in New Hampshire. That's my favorite. We are not New Hampshire. We are New Mexico. We are a majority state. In our school system, we are 76% minority kids. We never talk about what they need. You know what they need in New Hampshire in early childhood education. I know, yes, it works. It's successful. But if kids can't see themselves reflected anywhere, we don't talk about multicultural books. We don't talk about multicultural preparation of teachers. We don't talk on and on and on.
Yep.
And yes, we put more money. And yes, still, who are the kids that are failing?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is painful to go into a school and go there for 12 years and come out and you've never seen yourself reflected in any way, shape, or form. You know, you watch the TV, they'll have a program on something and they'll say, oh, you know, here's fulana de tal, but you know, in English. And they'll say, oh, and it's important that I have this job and that kids that look like me can then aspire to that. We never do that in New Mexico. I'm sorry. You know what? I'm just really frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
It's and you know, it's just I would just like to see it one time that we would say, let's try it. Let's try talking to minority kids. Let's show them what they look like. Let's show them that they have a rich history, that they have a rich culture, that we are part of what it is. Now, you know, the League of Women Voters, we go to there. How many Chicanas show up to these meetings? A handful, maybe 2. Joe and Elisa, maybe somebody else. Why? Because in our public education system, we have basically been told, yes, you can get an education and you get a good job, but this is not your world. So, I don't know how better to argue that it is important that our kids see themselves, that teachers realize that they're teaching to a multicultural population. Bueno, ahí la dejo. Gracias.
You're completely right. Everything you said is spot on. And I'm so glad you said it and that this is a space to say it and to be heard, because it's 100% right. It's all of this and more. And that's the kids who have so long suffered from the underinvestment in our systems, especially our schools in tribal communities and in rural areas and English language learners. And, I think there's I think there's some work. There was a question in the chat from Rebecca about the Yazzie court decision. I was actually involved in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. I was an expert witness making the case that New Mexico was not just underfunding our schools, but that there was a lack of culturally and linguistically appropriate education starting at our earliest years all the way up through high school. And so, it's that the court upheld that and that the state is taking plans. One thing I'd say that is happening, and to your question too, Rebecca, the department, the early childhood department, created the first, the nation's first ever deputy cabinet secretary focused on Native American early childhood education. And the person who staffs that she comes from Native communities herself. She is doing, I think, a great job, but there's so much work to do. And so I just appreciate that you brought that up. And I think that is the departments are, I think, learning how to work forward in that decision and make meaningful progress to what does it mean to be culturally and linguistically appropriate. And especially when working with tribes, how do you fund the tribes to educate youth the way that they know best how to do and should be in control of in their communities? But I think everything you said was spot on, and there's so much work to do, and there's so many resources needed to do it well, and to keep the folks who should be teaching in the schools in those schools. So just agree with what you said, and really appreciate you bringing it forward.
Hey, Dick?
Yes, I just want to emphasize how important the funding is. When I was co-chair of the Sandoval County Health Council, we had a program that included transportation and everything for supporting pregnant women, also coaching them after the children were born. We had community health workers who went out and visited them and everything else. And this was through funding through the Department of Health. In 2010, the funding was cut. We had to cut all those programs. We saw the effectiveness of those programs, but then the funding went away. And the women, particularly the women in rural Sandoval County, were left on their own. So that's why the funding, you may know the right things to do, but if the money's not there, you're not going to be able to do them.
Yep. Yeah, and to your point, Dick, we know that, like you said, that was 2010, and we know, and we've talked with you all about before, but just all the programs that were taken away. When we see a downturn in funding, the state will often pull from dedicated funds for specific services. And so we will show I can share all of that, Joe. But it's just really key to have a dedicated funding stream. And even, to somebody had asked in the chat about potential opposition about the issue, who was opposed to it. Looks like Karen. And there was an op-ed from the board of the Albuquerque Journal today in opposition of the fund, and kind of the argument was something we talked about. Well, don't we already have a lot of money? Don't we have a lot of money right now? And so one of the things that we're pushing back on is, New Mexico has a lot of money every 3-4 years. It's more extreme right now because we have federal money. But this is a cycle that we're on because we're so highly dependent on the oil and gas industry. And so we know that the funding that we have right now is temporary. It's oil and gas boom money and it's federal money. Those things will go away. We need to have a stable, sustainable source of revenue to fund the programs that New Mexico has worked on building for a decade, that has positioned, is getting that infrastructure in place, but so many families still lack access and lack financial support to be able to access those. And so I think that really is the biggest element of folks who have been in opposition or who have responded with caution about it, or aren't we doing enough? Haven't we done enough? But we clearly haven't. We clearly still have a long way to go, and dedicated funding, to your point, Dick, it's the foundation that it all can be built on.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, Joe's got her hand up.
I'm sorry, another question. So if only a portion of the funds are going through the funding formula, and I don't know if it's you or Dick that could answer this the best, what are the assurances, or who's going to oversee the 60% that's going to the early childhood programs, that there will be equity among all the school districts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, the 60% will go towards it'll go to the early childhood education and care department. And so it will be spent amongst the programs that the department already has established. So it's not earmarked for specific programs beyond the early childhood programs. And so early intervention, home visiting, pre-K, childcare assistance. And so those are that's what it can be spent on, but there's not a specific guided how much has to go to each. And so it will depend, I think that's a good question, because there is, in a way, it also depends on leadership within those departments and leadership within an administration. But what it does ensure is that even, we had what the LFC calls a lost decade, Dick was talking about 2010. We had a lost decade of funding in New Mexico for programs. We saw our college affordability fund rated. Teacher pay wasn't, we actually lost funding for education when you factored in inflation. We just had so many things. We had positions not filled, programs completely undersupported. And then that's when we actually fell over that decade to 50th in child well-being. So having funding to support the programs that we know matter most for kids and families is key. And so that's, it's a tough one, that it will go to the department, but it's to really well-established programs that it can be spent on.
Okay, did we cover everything in the chat? I just reposted the link to the journal editorial. And Amber, there was a question about, can we have the slides?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I can definitely send them, and I'll send those. And then, if you all are ever doing an in-person event or anything like that, or if anybody is doing something in their local area and wanted materials to hand out, we could also ensure those get to you in the mail too. So just feel free to ping me if that ever comes up.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Anyone else? Yes, Elisa.
I just wanted to mention, when we talked about Yazi Martinez was very specific. They said they wanted English learning learners. And, there's a lot of, our language has already been robbed by the educational system. We got beat up, we got punished for speaking Spanish. And so many of us have now lost the language. And so the thing is that it's important for you, Amber, to put on as you put things out, I look at them and I think, well, this is nice, but like I said before, this would look nice in New Hampshire. Everywhere that we talk about education, we need to talk about culturally relevant education. Teachers, the colleges of education, the League of Women Voters in Southern New Mexico, when Yazi Martinez came out, Eileen and I took different colleges of education and we called them and we said, are you prepared to teach teachers, to help teachers become multicultural teachers? Every one of them said no. So, it's like the whole system needs to
The
be
whole
revamped.
system. Yep,
But, I would say to you, Amber, all the stuff that you send out, you need to be able to put those kinds of words in. That'll buy a lot of more support, I think. Okay.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for saying it. I appreciate you saying it.
Are there any other questions for Amber or comments? Well, Amber, I think that may be it. Thank you again. We'll have the recording up on the website soon, and I'll let you know what happens with PBS. We have from Joe, great presentation, as absolutely usual, very articulate, so clear. I could listen to you talk about money for a long time, Amber. I've told you that before. Meredith has something to say here.
Well, I just have a question. Do you give your permission for this to be aired in segments on New Mexico in Focus or some other program on PBS? Is that okay? Your
Yeah.
slides and so on?
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And always happy to chat otherwise too, and members of our coalition, and we're always here. So please feel free.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people even know that it's on the ballot. There really hasn't been much on this topic in the news. And so I think, we need to keep on making sure that voters are aware of how
Yeah.
important it is.
Yep.
Thank you.
Agree. Yeah, it feels like
I
when
have
you
a
work for
question.
a long time, but yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, Vivian. Vivian? You're frozen. Let's see if you unfreeze while Dick is talking. He has a question too. Dick?
The state does support money and support private preschool programs, and there's a strict and cumbersome and lengthy application progress for private providers to receive funds from the state and to have the mechanism to do that. So there's a very strict system in place that you could make the argument that it should be more streamlined to allow more private providers, especially home-based providers, to get plugged into the system, because they provide really crucial services for so many families, and really largely staffed by women of color. And really largely that's how many of our communities, that's what's available in a lot of our rural communities. And so honestly, making systems more accessible to home and community providers is important. But the largely what could happen with additional funding is that it provides more funding into the system. And then so some of the money that comes to the early childhood programs from the general fund and from the early childhood trust fund could then be used to support private providers. And what if this money just needed to go to public providers, then this money could go towards that. But there is a system in place to ensure that all providers do have to go through a rigorous approval process from the department before they can provide services under state accepted money.
Just as a follow-up, do you know what the proportion of public preschools in the state are to private and parochial preschools? Because my thought is that the majority would be the latter.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's some piece of data that's in here somewhere and floating around somewhere, but I don't recall. But there are likely more private providers. Oftentimes public providers have bigger infrastructures, so there may be fewer, but they can support more families. But to your point, Vivian is spot on that there are tremendous amount of private providers in the state, especially home-based providers with just a few kiddos that they take care of.
One more
Joe?
quick one. Is that okay? You're muted, but I'm hoping you're saying it's okay. Okay, if in fact this amount, the percentage that goes into the permanent fund gets reduced, would that have to be approved also by a constitutional amendment? Or will it just all stay the same amount?
That's a great question. So there, part of the compromise in getting it passed was to set basically a floor. And so if the permanent fund ever dropped below a certain amount of money, then this additional distribution would stop. And so that's a safeguard on that. And, you know, we, not just, you know, our organization and our coalition, but really nobody expects it to drop. Certainly hope any time in recent, you know, in decades that are coming anytime soon, but there is a floor on that. And then beyond that, if it was to be changed again, it would again need voter approval since it will go into the Constitution. And so that's one of the things now this really is, and I forget who said it earlier, maybe Hannah, or no, maybe it was Meredith, but the point that this should be a voter's decision. And so if it is passed by voters, it could only be taken back by voters. And so it really is in the hands of New Mexicans to make the decision about how this funding could best be used. And we just think it's best used in those early years.
Well, thank you for all of your work on getting it passed.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you all for the partnership to get it here.
I think we have Dick and then Meredith.
Unmute. Yeah, I just want to say, as far as what league members can do, you know, actually the Albuquerque Journal editorial in opposition opens an opportunity for people to respond and say, and even in, you know, communities, other communities, just, you know, writing letters to the editor and other things, you know, why the voters should vote yes on Constitutional Amendment 1. So that's what the league does. So I encourage members to do it.
Okay, and then Meredith, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to,
I'm sorry.
when I was at the community college, the programs we ran for the state was through the Children, Youth, and Families Division, and we did training and technical assistance so that we would make sure that private providers had all the skills. They had to be licensed, and they had to have all the skills that were required to be, you know, certified. And there were different levels of certification, 5-star systems, and their compensation for childcare was based on where they were in terms of their skill level. And so a lot of people would say, I only want to be with a 5-star provider, which was an incentive for the providers to get more training and education and so on. So yes, in fact, you can have private providers if they're licensed through the state.
Amber, I wanted to say that part of our scheduled social media and other posting is going to be a message about looking on the back side of the ballot as soon as we get some zippy language.
Yes, I think that's wonderful. That feels like, you know, I mean, we and partners have been involved in efforts that had tons of public support and didn't end up passing. And that, you know, we saw one in Albuquerque just a few years ago, and it was on the backside of the ballot and it didn't pass. And so really think it's just important to have voices out there talking about it and making sure people know it's there and that it's a good thing. And so just appreciate you all and the education that you're doing around it. And Dick, your point about writing letters to the editor and op-eds and social media, that's all just important. And just really having conversations with folks that you know and talk to. That's one of the best things that can happen.
Great. All right. Well, we're at 7:28. Beautiful timing. Thank you so much again, Amber.
Thank you all again. Take care. Have a good evening.